Well, let's bring you more now on the Prime Minister's decision to suspend Parliament ahead of a possible no-deal Brexit. Well, today the former Conservative Prime Minister, Sir John Major, joined the campaigner Gina Miller in her legal challenge to try and thwart Boris Johnson's prorogation. Well, for more now, let's go live to Westminster and speak with the former parliamentary clerk Elliot Wilson and the former Labour advisor, now CEO of the New Economics Foundation, Miatta Fahbulleh. Very good afternoon to both of you. If I may first of all start off with you, Elliot Wilson, the Prime Minister does have a point, doesn't he, that all of these people uniting to try and block no deal is actually going to hinder his chance of getting any deal at all?
Well, I think that's a possibility. I think a greater point really is that, you know, he's not really done anything wrong. He's done something which is slightly naughty, but he's not gone against the rules. And this is sending out mixed optics, I think, to the rest of the European Union. It's saying that we have a crisis at home, which we're obviously trying to deal with, but that we're focusing all our attentions on what the government is doing rather than having wrangles in Parliament. So I think you can see it both ways. OK,
Miatta Fahbulleh, are we OK with a Prime Minister who's done something a little bit naughty?
Well, look, we'll see what the court says, but it looks like he has followed the letter of the law, but he's certainly not followed the spirit of it. The idea that we could be on the cusp of such an important outcome and that Parliament, you know, we're a parliamentary democracy, the idea that Parliament wouldn't be sitting in order to scrutinise the government is unthinkable. And, you know, for me, it's bad enough that the Prime Minister wants to tip us over the no-deal edge, which he has no democratic mandate to do so, and which his own economic watchdog says will hurt the economy, will cost us billions, tip us into recession. But to try to prevent Parliament from exerting its will, which is clearly to avoid a no-deal, is an affront to the very sovereignty that the Prime Minister tells us is the prize at the end of all of this.
OK, Elliot Wilson, I just want to pick up the point, because Miatta was saying there, wasn't she, that, you know, he may well have followed the law here, but not the spirit of it. And I wonder if, through proroguing Parliament, he's also been a little bit dishonest, because today is the first time he has admitted that it's to do or going to affect his ability to get a deal. Whereas earlier in the week, we understood it's absolutely nothing to do with Brexit, merely because he wanted to outline his domestic agenda.
Well, I think we need to be a little bit forgiving of politicians. There are things they have to say and things they really mean. But I just wanted to pick up on this idea that Parliament's not getting its proper say or not being involved. We've had 3 years since the referendum. We've had God knows how many votes on various permutations of how we should leave the European Union, given that that was the expressed will of the people through the referendum. And Parliament has failed to come up with a single plan which would take us forward. Now, I'm not blaming MPs, because obviously there are 650 people with very diverse opinions. But the idea that Parliament hasn't had an opportunity to say anything is just absurd. They've had 3 years to say something. And we're now talking about extending the non-sitting period by about 4 days over what it would have been anyway.
Miatta, is it all a bit of a fuss then, just about 4 or 5 days?
It's 4 or 5 crucial days in the run-up to potentially leaving the European Union without a deal. And yes, you know, I agree. You know, in some respects, Parliament has not stepped up because it's not driven a course of action. But it kind of feels like until this point, everyone thought that any sensible Prime Minister would look at the evidence, would look at the advice that would be provided him by his civil servants that says this is a bad course of action for the country. It will hurt families up and down the country. And looking at that, would decide that actually no deal is something that must be absolutely avoided. And it seems that we're now in this bizarre world where we have a Prime Minister that is seeing this advice, but still thinks this is a course of action that we might end up pursuing. And in that context, it's absolutely right that Parliament is there for every single second of the next month in order to scrutinise. But in the end, if it's the will of Parliament and they believe that this is the wrong course of action for the country, Parliament must be allowed to exert its will. And that is the thing that the Prime Minister is trying to curtail.
Elliot Wilson, you talked about Parliament's inability to come up with a solution. They'd voted against no deal. But one thing that they certainly were clear on is that they wanted to block no deal. That's what came out of indicative votes, didn't it?
Yes, that came out of the series of disastrously conceived and non-binding indicative votes, which a lot of us warned at the time would not bring the solution that was wanted.
But it is the democratic, you know, members of Parliament who have all agreed that they don't want to see no deal happen, which was never on the ballot paper during the referendum. And a lot of people will point to the fact that the Prime Minister personally wasn't elected as Prime Minister, and he does have a very small wafer-thin majority government.
Well, no Prime Minister is elected directly, so that's not really a criticism of the current incumbent over anyone else. And also, no particular deal was on the ballot paper. The ballot paper said, do you want to stay in the European Union or come out? And the people voted narrowly to come out. Now, they didn't authorise specifically a no-deal exit, but they didn't authorise staying in the common trade area or staying in the within freedom of movement or anything like that. I mean, I'm afraid to say that what Miatta's saying, and I do respect the argument she's trying to build, is that Remainers have basically sat on their hands until now, assuming that the Prime Minister would see sense in those terms and that it would all be fine. Whereas, in fact, what we've got is a Prime Minister who's said, we'll have no deal if it comes to it. And let's not forget, Parliament is coming back on the 14th of October. It's not being prorogued until after the date when we're due to leave. So there is going to be, admittedly, a short time in which they can debate these issues, and the government may choose not to put it in front of the House in a simple binary vote. But Parliament will be sitting when we leave the European Union, and it'll be Parliament's opportunity, Parliament's responsibility to formulate some kind of response to what the government clearly wants to do, and it has failed to do so far.
Well, Miatta Fahbulleh, I'll let you come back to that point.
Yeah, I mean, look, to pick up on Elliot's point about there being a democratic mandate for this, like, I don't think this is a point about remain or leave. I think this is a point about what is best for the country in the long term. And all the evidence, everything you're hearing from economists, everything you're hearing from other people is saying this is not the right course of action. And in the end, the Leave campaign were very clear that a deal was on the table. In fact, we were told it was the easiest deal in the world to get. And when those on the Remain side mooted the idea that we might crash out, it was called Project Fear. So at no point did people go, I believe, to the ballot box believing that we would leave without a deal. We were told we were going to leave without a deal. So I completely refute the argument that actually this is an option that was ever put as a feasible one to the public.
Elliot, I just want to ask you whether you think the Prime Minister might be regretting his decision to prorogue Parliament, given that it seems to have galvanised his critics, his opponents, those Remainers, given that, you know, even the thought of the threat of a confidence vote seemed to be diminishing next week.
I don't know the Prime Minister personally, but I don't think he is particularly a person to have regrets. You know, he may have done things in his life, both politically and personally, which he might regret, but I don't think he looks back particularly. So, no, I don't think he'll be regretting it. I think he'll see this as one way forward which is open to him, one he's taken. And also, I think, and this is where the Remain camp, and I'm not associated with either camp particularly, needs to be a little bit careful. I think the Prime Minister is starting to build a narrative of Parliament against the people. There is a sense in the country, just as strong as the sense of betrayal and fascism and a coup, that the people's wish to leave the European Union is not being listened to, and people are trying to use legal means, legal cases, different forms of technicality to prevent it. So I just think people should be a little bit careful about rushing to judgment. I think the Prime Minister has taken a decision. We need to cope with that. We need to deal with the reality as it is, and those on both sides need to adapt. OK, well, look, a final thought. We are running out of time, Miatta Fahbulleh, but I just wonder whether you think that this is a problem with our constitution. If there was a written constitution in this country, would be facing such a zombie parliament as we are at the moment? Well, I think there's a question about our constitution, our politics that comes out of all of this. I mean, in many respects, the response to Brexit has shown the weaknesses and failure of our political institutions that had already lost quite a lot of trust amongst the public. And so I think there is a big question about how we rebuild that, which comes back to, you know, the course of action that the Prime Minister takes. In what he does now, he must be thinking of the outcomes afterwards, after the 31st of October, because he's got to bridge the country and he's got to bring the country together, and he's got to build trust back in Parliament. And if he pitches this as Parliament against the people, he risks dividing the country in a way that will be almost irreconcilable. A note of agreement between you both there then. Miatta Fahbulleh, Luke Wilson, thank you both very much indeed for your time this afternoon.